Last time we largely focused on understanding where each of us was coming from, what a pause AI view is about, what effective acceleration is about, and just where we are as individuals. Today, I want to start going into some of the actual risks and benefits of AI. I put these into three categories. One, what I call winners and losers, or AI-enabled methods for some people to capture value from others. This includes job loss, deepfakes, etc. Second is multipolar traps, or AI-enabled adaptive behavior that everyone must imitate or be left behind, even if the end result is worse for everyone. This includes things like military escalation. And then lastly is agentic AI, when the AI itself becomes a player in the game of power and sweeps people off the board. This is the classic X-risk stuff. Now, that description was kind of biased because I was describing the negative side. Each of these categories, I imagine, also has a positive side. And I think I want to cover those as well. I'm going to resist the impulse to talk about X risk and focus on the earlier ones, starting with the idea of some people will win and some people will lose. I want to hear your perspective on how that balances out.
Yeah, so on the topic of winners and losers, I don't know who the winners and losers are going to be. That's my conclusion right now. And it's not for lack of thinking about it. I think it's hard to know. Thinking back, it seems like the people's intuition about this has changed a lot. For example, I think maybe 10 years ago, people's thoughts about automation or AI automation would be somewhat similar to the automation of the 20th century, which is that manual tasks will get automated. People who do manual tasks will get replaced. So we'll have like robot butlers or something like that. We can see that's not really what's happening. It turns out AI automation is really good at more white collar kind of work. But even there, it's not really clear which kinds of work are going to get unemployed, maybe which ones are going to get super employed because they'll just be so much more productive now. I've heard people consider every different industry, including my own of programming. Yeah, so I don't know who the winners and losers are, but it seems pretty likely that there will be some.
I think the thing that I'm really concerned here is long-term unemployment, where large segments of the population are unemployed through no fault of their own. They've really invested in a particular line of work, and it's difficult to get to somewhere else. If that rate of people gets higher, that seems like it would create some instability. Do you think like AI is just going to create jobs to replace those so that the permanent unemployment stays about the same? What do you think will happen with that?
I'm skeptical that there could be long-term permanent unemployment. I'm more open-minded to the idea of short-run unemployment. I just think people will fill their time with something, even in the worst-case scenario where human labor is just absolutely inferior to the productivity of AI labor. That wouldn't lead to the conclusion that we won't hire any people. In real life, some people are way better at a job than other people, but we find productive uses for both kinds of people. People who are really good and people who are not so good at a kind of job.
Naively, it would seem like there's a certain amount of jobs in the world. You automate some of them, there's fewer jobs.
One reason I don't see it that way is when we have new technology, sometimes it replaces jobs and sometimes it makes jobs even more employable because they're more productive. It's not clear just which way that's going to go for any given technology. I guess I'm not seeing like a fixed pool of jobs. If there's just a bunch of people who could just had free time, they're looking for something, that's a market opportunity. You can look for something for them to do. You can start utilizing that labor. They want to use their labor too. I think people are creative in that regard, what they do with their time.
The phrase I've heard in these discussions a lot is that automation will, in the long run, create new jobs. How does that work?
Generally speaking, when you have a technology that is productivity enhancing, it could just be a complete substitute for people. There used to be people who would operate the elevator, but they've been totally replaced by controls that people can just push buttons. That's one way that technology unemploys people. Now nobody's employed as an elevator operator. But another way that technology goes is that it makes a job more productive. And when it's more productive, people want even more of it. And so they want to hire even more people doing it. So I can think of examples like power drill, for example. That used to be a manual thing. People, they got a drill bit and they use their hands to turn it to cut holes in manufacturing. But a power drill makes that more productive. It makes it even more worthwhile to do that manufacturing task of drilling because you can get so much more done. People want to do that now. They want to be productive. They get paid more when they're more productive. And since the technology makes it more productive, they do more of it.
So by automating aspects of the task, it gives it a higher return on investment for hiring a person. Then maybe the companies start pursuing lines of work that previously would not have been cost effective. And now all of that opens up because the ROI is better. So there ends up being more of it. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
There's a thought experiment from Max Tegmark's book, Life 3.0, which I find is informative here. If you imagine house painters, and let's just assume for simplicity that the only thing that matters in terms of their productivity is the width of their brush. Now, if you start out with house painters that have a single bristle, that's kind of useless. Then now if you expand that out to like a very narrow brush, then maybe royalty uses it as a symbol of something. And then it gets a little bit wider, and now it's something that's used by rich people, still as a status symbol, but a little bit more widely. And this, like the number of painters goes up. Again, you keep widening it, and then eventually it becomes something that everyone does because it's cool to have your house painted. And it's no longer just a status symbol anymore. But then as the brush continues to get wider, eventually the market's already saturated. There's no new houses to paint, and we're just fewer people to reach the same market. So you can see like a curve in this hypothetical scenario of the number of house painters starting like low, kind of goes up like a bell curve, and then comes back down again with increasing automation. So the two questions there would be, one, is that model reasonable at all, or is it missing critical things? And then second, where are we on the curve in terms of automation today?
That's an interesting hypothetical or way of looking at it. That makes sense to me. I think in the broadest view of the economy, in the longest term, the economy is just not like that. So I think I would disagree to that extent. That there's not some finite amount of work to be done that we're just going to fill up at some point. Maybe a specific industry, maybe a specific kind of task in the short run, maybe. In the grand scheme of things, I don't think so.
So your view of the analogy here, to reiterate, is that that might kind of apply for a job or a task, but it doesn't really work for the economy as a whole because that can just expand.
Yeah, basically, maybe when they first invented electricity and they're laying out electrical lines to everyone's house, at some point you're just going to get to all the houses that exist. But that's not the only kind of wire that we're going to want to lay out. People are going to come up with a new kind of wire, then we're going to have to lay that one out. People will come out with a wire that carries more electricity. In the grand scheme of things, there's iterations on things like that.
When you were giving that earlier example of the power drills, that being partially automated, and so now there's more people drilling things, that one sounded like it kind of fit that analogy fairly well. Like this idea of superemployment is that you're on the left side of the curve and now there's more of it. And that might change if you keep automating further. But that's only one part of this idea of the connection between automation and jobs is superemployment. There's also this idea of the economy as a whole. This idea that there are not really a finite amount of work to be done if you don't just look at a specific industry. What does that look like in terms of, even if specific jobs are automated away, the economy as a whole expands to include everyone?
Yeah, maybe I've got a question, which is like,
Sure.
what's the tension in these two ideas? This is that like things will evolve, but then people will not be able to keep up with the changing economic needs.
I want to just like get a concrete sense of the positive side of it. The idea of the economy will create new jobs to replace the old ones that are totally different, that don't exist today.
It seems like there's a tendency of people not wanting or being able to change jobs later in their career. Someone who's maybe 40 or 50 might be invested in a line of work and they're not ready to retire, but they don't have the income to, but suddenly the economy changes and they're sort of helpless. So that seems like one issue. The pace of change and employment reshuffling doesn't match up with like a natural human life cycle. That seems like one issue. Another one is that people's jobs tend to just, their income always goes up. And I can see some futures where, well, this is somewhat fanciful, but everything's way cheaper and way more productive. We also can't afford to pay people what we used to. So they have to accept some kind of pay cut. In some ways, in a lot of ways, their life's better than it used to be. But then what are people psychologically going to do if they're suddenly unemployed or they have to take early retirement or something like that? Those are some tension I can see.
Coming back to this initial point of winners and losers, is you might have new jobs being created, such as programming didn't exist 100 years ago. And basically all jobs that are involving computers are new things that didn't exist before. Maybe there'll be something else that we can't really imagine that's created in the future. But one tension that comes from that, and this kind of plays into the question of short term versus what evens out over time, is that's great for young people who are going into the world and they're going to take a really novel job that didn't exist before, and they can either train for it or just be ready by getting a broad skill set and then jumping into it. But it can still be frustrating for people who are really invested and not able to shift. That was one point. And I think that's something that's happened that people are probably familiar without giving direct examples of it. What gets superemployed is not obvious in advance. It's easy to see how the work that's being done now, if that gets automated, there's less. It's harder to see the new opportunities that open up when something's has a higher return on investment, the new industries that become viable that previously just weren't because it just cost too much to pay people for the things.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's a good point. The one side, people losing their job, is way more obvious to people than the employment side.
I guess why I'm like a little bit skeptical as to new unexpected things will show up, even in the long view of like replacing the things that get lost, is that if you look at a lot of the highest employing jobs, a lot of them are the same as they have been for a long time. Teachers, police, truck drivers. And so the pattern that I see from that is people squeezing into a smaller and smaller range of jobs rather than it just changing.
This isn't data I've looked up anytime recently,
Sure.
but I had an impression that 150 years ago, everyone was a farmer, and now nobody's a farmer.
So the thing I was drawing from, and I can link this in the description of this video, is there was a CGP Grey. He has a popular YouTube channel and has a video 10 years ago or so. It's called Humans Need Not Apply. And it lays out like the classic reasons for thinking that automation is different this time. There's a naive view of automation just replaces jobs. Then there's a response to that saying, wait a minute, we've been through this before in the Industrial Revolution. In industrialization, automated a lot of things. That's like largely what it was. You did not see massive unemployment as a result of that. Same thing with the digital revolution. That automated a bunch of things. We don't see mass employment from it. Now we have an AI revolution coming up. It follows the same pattern we've had multiple times before. It's not really obvious how we'll just adapt, but that's what's happened in the past, and that's what our priors should be. That new things will come up, somehow it'll work out, even if it's not obvious how that happens. Does that sound like an accurate characterization of where your priors are so far?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So then what Gray writes out this idea, looking at what professions actually employ people and what's happened to those. And they're saying reasons why the AI revolution may be different from the previous revolutions. And then that gets to that idea of the brush and that parabola curve is an underlying point. And the idea of the kinds of jobs not changing is like a specific data. One flaw that is just occurring to me right now is that list of 100 jobs not changing. I guess you have to be pretty selective about what time period you're looking at. So if you say 80 years ago, it holds up pretty well. But if you say 500 years ago, then it totally doesn't at all. Like you mentioned, most people just being farmers.
Yeah, I can see it.
The other point you mentioned earlier is that it's not just about getting a wage increase or a pay cut. If something's automated, then that can decrease the price on it, which can improve the standard of living for people, even if their pay technically went down.
When technology gets better, the process of making good things in our life, or the products at the very least, is more efficient. And that seems to have wide benefits for all the people who consume those things, as benefits for all the people who associate with the people who consume those things by extension. Efficiency sort of radiates out and affects lots of people. But job loss is somewhat localized to just the people who lose their jobs. If some sector becomes much less employed, those people suffer for losing their job. But then if the sector also becomes way more productive, everyone, including the people who lost their jobs, benefit from that productivity. Maybe it's clear to think about like agricultural workers. If agriculture is very manual, and then we make robots that do agriculture, suddenly those people are unemployed. But then if agriculture is more efficient, the people who are unemployed also benefit from lower prices for food because they eat like everyone else.
If the industry cuts costs, why does that benefit everyone? Doesn't that just mean that the company gets a larger profit margin and those few people make more money and it doesn't radiate out?
That could be the case. I don't want to dismiss it outright, but if there's a competitive industry, which is maybe not the case, then firms would try to reduce prices down closer to their cost. And so they'd have incentive to lower their prices because otherwise they go out of business or they wouldn't be competitive. They'd sort of be forced to, just by the market forces, to lower the costs. They couldn't just hoard money or take that surplus. I don't think reality is perfect, and I don't know exactly, empirically how the world works, but that's the standard economic answer.
The point about economics is there's two limited views as to how prices are set. One is this cost plus model. And this isn't like an economic model. This is just something kind of inferred from what people say. You have a cost of producing something, you add a little bit to profit, and that's your price. So if the cost goes down, price goes down with it. And then the other side of it is saying like, no. Prices are set by supply and demand. Whatever people are willing to pay, that's what gets set as the price. So if your cost goes down, that doesn't affect what people are willing to pay. You just make more. The price is going to go up or down based on how valuable the good is and other things like that. I think both of these models actually have some truth to them, but they fall apart when you just assume one all the time for everything. And the reality is some kind of mix between those and will also vary depending on context.
Yeah, I like that. Sounds right to me.
And I think in terms of what makes that vary, what you said, I think is exactly it. The idea of competition. If something's non-competitive, then that supply and demand, just keep the profits, fits pretty well. But when there is competition, then the industries will keep undercutting each other until you hit the point where, hey, if we undercut any more, we're going out of business. If someone outcompetes us, they outcompete us. And then you get something more like the cost plus model.
I did have one other thought that is related to AI. If AI comes to dominate the whole economy, it's both producing almost everything, it's generating all, it's taking almost all the income. It's the other side of that equation, right? If it's producing everything, it's also making all the value, making all the money. If it finds no value for people, what are people going to do for work? How are they going to make money? Where are they going to get stuff to keep their lives together? It seems like in that situation, they would all kind of cancel out. If there's an AI economy where AI could just make everything for itself and has no need to interact with people, people could still do the things that they used to do for each other. It would almost be like a parallel economy in a way. That seems like a possibility. I know all this is fanciful, but that's one reason why I'm not worried about mass unemployment. Because if AI does dominate the economy, it's also likely to just sort of disconnect itself from people. People can just kind of continue trading with each other as they used to.
What might that look like?
So suppose that AI gets very, very powerful and very autonomous, and maybe the only thing it really wants to consume is power and mathematical proofs or something, and it can get all the like the physical resources it needs on its own. Humans have nothing to offer. We can't make proofs fast enough, so it doesn't really want to employ us. But people still like they need food and they need, everything else. They need shelter, things like that. They need TVs and ordinary things. They still have the opportunity to do those things on their own. They can still work jobs that make those things and provide. AI is just not a factor in that. It's not a closed loop where AI is making things for people. People have to be able to provide something to the AI. They have to be on the other side of that exchange. So either they have the money to do that, which implies that they have a job, or they don't, and then the transaction doesn't happen, in which case it goes back to being a closed loop.
Playing this hypothetical out, if the AI was automating all the things, it wouldn't have any reason to trade because the people wouldn't be able to offer it anything. And so the AI would choose not to automate anything because it would just be a one-way transaction if it didn't really need to accumulate more resources or something. Suppose instead of just this, like AI is this self-contained system, there's people who own that AI and they're basically rent seeking on everything. The kind of thing that I'm concerned about here in this job loss category isn't so much being replaced by AI so much as facilitating increasingly unequal distribution of wealth, where a very small number of people who own those AI systems then own everything. That's really the underlying concern, not just job loss.
Yeah, that makes sense. I see it that way too, that if there's some powerful technology might lead to a lot of inequality.
Specifically, monopolies is really the thing. If no one can compete with them, then you have a monopoly, and then there's all the issues that monopolies have.
Monopolies are an interesting topic, even outside of AI. I don't know what the solution is because I know we have law to break up monopolies, but I don't know how effective that is, or if it would be effective in the future where there's super powerful. Monopoly is bad, but I don't know if it's the worst thing. If you have to pick between various economic problems, monopoly might be not be the worst one. Say monopoly makes the economy like 20% less efficient. Other things could make it 30% or something. It could be worse in other regards.
What the specific worst thing that you're thinking of here?
Oftentimes people talk about a tragedy of the commons. Like if there's a
Mhm.
field that people share, they might not use the resources well because they have an incentive to consume as much as they can before it's depleted by other people. But that might be solved by monopoly. If just one person owns the field. Now, that's not good because that's all the problems with monopoly, but it could be better than the depletion problem.
As I understand the way modern economics works, is it, at least in theory, tries to use elements of both, where the government has a monopoly on force, like military power, including police and that sort of thing, so that they can enforce rules against tragedy of the commons type scenarios. But then they release power and leave that to the free market on everything else so that you can get all the efficiency of people creatively competing with each other. The last thing I had on mind to bring all this talk of automation to a specific example, I'm thinking of artists, because that's one job that I have like a lot of sympathy for that seems to be feeling a lot of pressure from automation lately. So pulling out of the abstract to the more personal kind of things, how should we deal with the fact that people pursuing things that they love are having a harder time with it?
I see this too. Like this is the one job category where I've actually just seen people say, "I've lost my job. I can't do this anymore." This category of job is unique in that people love it. They enjoy doing it. They have a passion for it. They have like a deep meaning doing it. But one thing I'm noticing is, are we considering like people losing their job doing it, or are we considering the activity itself? Because there's far more art hobbyists or recreational artists than there are professional ones. I've done some art myself, so I feel like I can relate, but I don't want to speak for everyone. I wonder if people get the satisfaction out of it on their own time. I know that might be harder, right? Because people have day jobs and things like that. But with the actual quantity, in a more efficient economy, we have more abundance. Would people actually lose the opportunity to do the activity and get the meaning out of it? Or would they just lose the job opportunity to do it?
Those seem deeply connected. There's a very qualitative difference in how one can pursue art when it's a full-time thing versus a hobby. When you're really able to immerse yourself, you can engage with it just on a create different sorts of things on a different sort of level than you can just sort of dabbling in like after work hours. And I've actually felt this in working in game design. Working in an artistic field as a job means you can have that full dedication and not have to spend most of your time doing some other things. Now, that's maybe separate from the fact that the art gives you money. If you could just spend all your time doing that and you just were independently wealthy, for example, then you could say that, well, okay, you're not making money anymore, but that's something you should just be able to let go of.
I'm seeing connections back to what we were earlier talking about, which is that to really get the deep meaning out of an activity, maybe you have to do it all the time rather than half the time or something. The scale of how much you're invested in matters quite a lot. I've noticed that too in programming. I've got two kids and now I can't program recreationally. I have got like 1 hour of time, but that's not enough to program recreationally. There's this natural human life cycle of a day or of a lifetime that might not fit with the different scaling of technology.
The other concern I've heard from artists before, this is more on like a moral sort of level, which is that there's two definitions of art. One is just making like in drawing, it'd be like making pretty pictures and the things that like people can see. And the other aspect of art is as communication of the artist has something they're trying to communicate and they're using some medium to express that. A criticism or a complaint with AI art is it's just art, treating art just as a commodity. The only thing that matters is the end thing that the user gets that they can like appreciate putting on their wall or whatever else, but strips out the communicative nature of it. And so a lot of artists feel like deeply insulted by the existence of AI art at all because it enables people to treat it in that purely commoditized sort of way.
These are interesting topics. Like it does seem like a real problem. Like, I want to acknowledge that. You've brought up this question of like art as communication or art as a product. I think I have a position on that one, which is like, I don't think of art as a form of communication. That's nothing to say about the people who do and the people who see value in that. I think that's the thing that jazz musicians say that they're having a conversation when they're playing music with each other. But just as a music history example, classical composer John Cage, I think he heard that and he said, if you want to have a conversation, use words. So I think it sounded like the nuts and bolts of what people are doing when they're communicating. If it's just about communication, then there is actually the bottom line, like a practical matter, which actually seems to lose some of the majesty of art. That's just my opinion on that particular philosophical question.
Given this kind of issues and all the considerations that we've brought up about it, what, if anything, should be done, and what's the kind of the core rationale that we should drive decision making going forward?
One thing we've acknowledged is that we don't know a lot of things. A lot of history's been surprising so far. I guess it is a matter of what are you going to do given that you don't know? Does the unknown mean that it should be like a total laissez-faire freedom, let people do whatever they want with AI, or should it be highly regulated? I guess my feeling is that it's too early to do any kind of regulation because we don't know what would be a meaningful regulation. But I totally understand if people have different feelings than my own on that.
Regulation, even if it's warranted, needs to be targeted. And when there's too much unknowns, then you're going to get bad regulation.
Basically, yeah. Yeah.
I'd say, since this is closing thoughts, I'm kind of proponent of having some kind of universal basic income as a safety net for the people who get left behind, although that comes with big challenges in terms of how does that get supported and what happens if you have a situation where people own everything. Like, what if they decide not to pay it out anymore? What does everyone else do? Go on strike? with the jobs they don't have. And dealing with those kind of issues requires dealing with who owns the AI. That gets a little bit more complicated than I can deal with here. I would definitely agree that any kind of solution needs to be something elegant and handles the issues of the unknowns rather than trying to assume that we know everything and getting a very targeted thing that sort of makes sense now, but is ultimately nearsighted. As to figuring out what that balance is, I think we'll not be able to speak to that today, but anyone in the comments, if you have some kind of grand plan or vision or data points that are interesting, please share those and I look forward to discussing it. This was only the beginning of a conversation, not the end of one. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hey, I just want to say this is awesome. I really appreciate it. You've been so welcoming. And not just because I love talking and thinking about these things, but I just love the format of just two people who don't quite see eye to eye, just trying to hear each other out. Thanks so much for doing a good thing.